Typically, when it comes to politics, especially politics and comedy like this, Veep is, in my opinion, the gold standard. Hello, and welcome to our 31st installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the 7th episode of Season 2, entitled The Candidate. We're only slightly out of production order this week, with production code 206 for this episode, and we'll eventually be spot on for the next 2 weeks, with the two-parter Adventures in Paradise. This episode originally aired on November 8th, 1994, and given that date, I'm positive I know the reason for the production numbers here. In the United States, per federal law, the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November is when the November elections are always held. In this case, it was November 8th, 1994. With the election theme of this episode, I really can't blame the creators for seizing the opportunity for the premiere date to be on election night. On this election night, Frasier brought in 19.2 million viewers. That's a rather steep drop of 4.6 million viewers, pulling us well below the season average, and a steeper drop than either Friends or Seinfeld will experience this week. My only theory for why this drop was so steep is perhaps it had to do with the aforementioned synchrony of actually showing this episode on election night. Granted, people weren't near as obsessed with politics as they are today, but there would certainly be some people who would choose to watch the news and see who'd won the elections instead of watching Frasier tonight. While both Friends and Seinfeld saw declines of 1 million and 2.4 million respectively, it is worth remembering Frasier is the only show airing on Tuesdays. The other two are currently airing on Thursdays, which puts 2 days between the election and the new episodes airing there. In any event, the most interesting thing on this chart is the newest James Burrows-directed episode of Friends outranks Frasier again this week, marking the second time the series has done this already, and making it much more of a battle between Frasier and Friends than it ever was between Frasier and Seinfeld. The Candidate marks the 19th episode of the series James Burrows has directed, meaning he will only direct another 13 episodes before leaving the series. On writing duties this week, we have my favorite writing duo of Flett and Ramberg, returning for their 7th of 16 episodes. Before we get too much into the meat of the episode, I want to take a moment to talk about the fact that this is a political episode, and one handled in a way I hadn't necessarily expected. Typically, when it comes to politics, especially politics and comedy like this, Veep is, in my opinion, the gold standard. The Julia Louis-Dreyfus series ran for 7 seasons, and outside of one red and blue campaign map in the final season, there was never any indication given which political party our protagonist was the VP for. It was masterfully done, and I thought a very smart way to keep from giving anyone biases, one way or the other, for our main characters on the show. In this case, we're getting something a little bit different. We're getting some outright political statements from all of our main cast, and the thing is, everyone's support lines up exactly where you'd think it would, so it doesn't really feel too bothersome. It's sort of like the episode of King of the Hill where Hank wasn't sure he wanted to vote for George Bush anymore because he found out Bush had a weak handshake. Yes, we're straight up making a political statement on who the character supports, but given what we know about the characters, it doesn't feel out of place. Anyway, we'll talk more about this as we get into the episode. This episode starts out with the return of the red blinking dot on top of the Space Needle. I feel pretty confident saying we're done with new intros for the season now. This marks the second time we've seen the red blinking dot this season, and the 9th time overall, making it again the most common intro, just ahead of the elevator introduction. We open with a shot overlooking the TV, focusing on all 4 members of the Crane family. It's a pretty different angle from many we've had before, and it actually made me think we'd swapped out Frasier's coffee table for a moment here, because we can't see the lower part of it at all. We have an excellent and wide-ranging expressions from each member of our family here. I think it really encapsulates just perfectly how each of them feel about Martin's political ad. As they watch Martin's commercial, a commentary from the family occurs, and I have to say I was really surprised to hear the term fascist used to describe Martin's candidate of choice. This is a term we hear thrown around quite a bit today, but it wasn't one I realized was being brandied in the 1990s. I can vaguely remember hearing it as early as the Bush and Kerry elections, but I didn't know it ever happened before that. I'm guessing that just has more to do with my age and awareness of politics at the time than anything else. But it really goes to show that the more things change, the more they stay the same. This tidbit aside, we get some more excellent reaction shots after the commercial airs. I like Daphne a lot here, as she looks shocked at what she's just seen, then just a moment later tells Martin what a wonderful job he's done. It's possible Daphne's expression of shock was genuine surprise at how much Martin was on TV, or it's possible she's offended by his choice in candidates. Coming from a British background, Daphne is the only member of the cast I wouldn't have felt comfortable guessing what her political leanings were. So it's just as possible she's somewhat baffled by American politics in general as anything else. We do get one comment about politics in Britain, and it's probably the most famous one there is. Daphne says she's glad there's not so many guns in England, and Frasier says that's because they have kidney pie. I don't want to get too much into the guns in England thing, but that's been a joke for as long as I can remember, so it's nice to see it used again here. On the kidney pie front, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a meat pie made with beef, some kind of animal kidney, and onion. I personally don't like organs at all, and I think this sounds really gross. Even though we won't see Duke again for a while, we get a phone call from him here to congratulate Martin on his TV appearance. It's a cool reference and a nice reminder of Martin's friends and his ties to them. Hopefully we'll get more references like this to the characters from Duke's Bar, even if we don't see many of them again. While he's talking to Duke, Martin says that he learned that they can make you cry on cue by pulling out a nose hair. There's actually an interesting scientific reason behind this. Nose hairs go right into the mucosa of the nose. So when that area is disturbed by removing a nose hair, you're agitating the mucosa and triggering a response to get the irritant out of your body, which will cause both your eyes to water and your nose to run. At the end of the day, it's sort of like a less painful version of being pepper sprayed. One other thing of interest to note before we move out of this scene, Martin says he doesn't see the big deal showing off his scar, as Lyndon Johnson did the same thing. This is actually true. In October 1965, after having gallbladder surgery, Johnson lifted his shirt and showed the scar to reporters. Our next scene opens on Frasier ranting about his problem with different countries that they export coffee from. The waitress should look familiar here. This is Lakhari, who we first saw in episode 22 of season 1 and talked about at length there. This is her third of 11 appearances on the show, and as always, it's a treat to see just how Frasier harasses our poor waitress. There are two quick things I want to touch on while we're in the coffee shop. First is we have daily specials listed all over the place. Cafe Nervosa has never had daily specials before, so this is pretty cool, and we get plenty of good shots at them. So even if we hadn't heard Lakhari rattle them off Frasier a moment ago, it would have been interesting to note what the specials of the day were. The other thing I want to talk about is actually our first guest spot of the episode, and that's the anonymous boy selling chocolates, played by Christopher Wahlberg. Wahlberg is a fairly minor actor and is no relation to Marky Mark. Wahlberg is best known either for his role as Timmy in the 1994 film The Little Giants, or his 70-odd appearances as the voice of Stinky Peterson on Hey Arnold. Beyond those appearances, he only has a couple credits to his name. Most notably, he appeared in the Gloria Vane pilot, written by Joe Keenan and directed by James Burrows. Following Hey Arnold, Wahlberg retired from acting and moved to Tennessee, where he is currently both the singer and bassist for the rock band H-Beam. Wahlberg doesn't have a whole lot to do here, but I absolutely love this scene. And Niles' casual dismissiveness of buying chocolates to send a boy to camp is both hilarious and a perfect nihilism that just becomes a fantastic joke and is possibly my favorite joke in the episode. Our next scene opens with this week's guest caller, who we've already heard a lot about, and that's Martin's candidate, Holden Thorpe. Thorpe is played by Sidney Pollack, who, like last week's guest caller, Alfre Woodard, Pollack is one of those guest callers that was already very famous at this time, and famous just for being a Hollywood guy. He's best known as both an actor and a director, and has won numerous awards, including 2 Academy Awards, a Primetime Emmy, and numerous Golden Globe and BAFTA nominations. He got his start acting in a number of one-offs in the 50s and 60s TV shows, including The Twilight Zone, The Kaiser Aluminum Hour, Brenner, and Tales of Wells Fargo, before moving primarily into direction and production by the 60s. During the first half of the 60s, he directed mainly TV shows, including The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Wagon Train, and Ben Casey. By the mid-1960s, he'd moved to directing movies, including They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, Jeremiah Johnson, The Firm, Sabrina, and Tootsie. Before his death in 2008, Pollack made a few recurring acting roles in television, including appearing in 5 episodes of Will and Grace and an episode of The Sopranos. He was married to his wife Claire for 50 years and had 3 children. He remained active in Hollywood and directing until the last few months of his life. One thing I've wanted to talk about for a while in the radio station is their recording media. And we get a pretty good shot of Roz holding them here, so now's as good a time as any. I was fairly sure from earlier episodes that they were recording the shows on 8 tracks, and thanks to the translucent blue cases Roz is holding here, we can be sure that's what's being used. 8 tracks are considered an obsolete technology today, and compared to the other recording media options out there, I feel they were always one of the weaker ones. The strengths of 8 tracks include that they could be played forever in a continuous loop without the need to be ejected, turned over, or rewound. There were 4 channel 8 tracks, which although this didn't quite allow the individual track selection, it did allow you to get much closer than just fast forwarding or rewinding to the song you were looking for. And finally, they were really easy to snap in and out of machines. And you could abuse the cases quite a bit, which made the speed to change them out not even remotely comparable to CDs or cassette tapes. With that said, the biggest limitation of 8 tracks is they only had a 50-minute recording capacity, meaning albums that were longer than 50 minutes, but not long enough to merit a second 8-track, would often get truncated versions on their 8-track release, which is a deal-breaking issue in my book. By 1990, the sale of blank, home-use 8-tracks had pretty much vanished. I find it interesting that in 1995, KACL is still using them. But assuming they made the change over to 8 tracks during the 80s, when it was a much more popular recording solution, it makes sense even a mid to large-sized radio station like this would keep with what they have until they've used it up completely. We have Dan Butler's Bulldog Briscoe showing up for a much better use here than last week. He has exactly the same joke he had the first time we met him, way back in episode 2, but I don't mind because Butler's always a treat to have on. And anytime we get some good Bulldog obnoxiousness, I'm fully on board with it. We meet our final guest star of the episode, and Niles and Frasier's candidate of choice with Boyd Gaines' Phil Patterson. Gaines has been a pretty busy actor since he first appeared on screen in 1980 on Alan Parker's Fame. Shortly after that, he appeared in Porky's and 57 episodes of One Day at a Time. From there, he's kept busy with 1 or 2 off appearances on a number of TV shows, including spots on LA Law, Spencer for Hire, Murder, She Wrote, and The Days and Nights of Molly Dodd. Additionally, he'll go on to appear in Law and Order, Carolyn in the City, and the English version of Funny Games, which is a weird movie because it's pretty much a shot-for-shot remake of the original 1997 Austrian version. Gaines is doing quite well today and is still very active in the acting community. Before we get into the rest of the episode, we have one more blink and you miss some guest spot this week, with Jack Tate's role as the nameless director of the commercial. Tate is a minor actor who has done mostly television roles, including appearances on Knots Landing, Murder, She Wrote, Columbo, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Team Knight Rider, The West Wing, and most notably, 61 episodes of the 1991 children's television series Dinosaurs, where he worked as an extra. This is the only time he'll appear on Frasier, and he's one of those interesting one-offs that perfectly encapsulates actors from the 1990s. Moving into the rest of the episode, we get the big confession from Patterson and learn his deepest, darkest secret, which is he thinks that he's been abducted by aliens. Although he will show up as a guest caller in Season 3, I can't but help feel that this was a huge missed opportunity to have David Duchovny on the show. The X-Files was huge by the time this episode came out, and the joke would have been perfect if the role had been Duchovny's. While Frasier freaks out about who he just endorsed, we get a nice shot of his bathroom. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first time we've seen it since episode 6 of season 1. And it's interesting to note that Frasier has found a new painting to hang in the place of honor above his toilet. Apparently, the knockoff he accidentally purchased way back in episode 6 is no longer good enough for the bathroom. Niles has a great line where he says he knows a simple trick to get around doctor-patient confidentiality. It's a really funny line and another great example of just where Niles falls on the ethical spectrum of things. I do have to wonder if it was strictly necessary, though. Yes, Patterson spoke to Frasier in confidence, but I don't think there was ever any implication that Frasier was acting as a psychologist. But maybe that's just my misunderstanding of events. A quick note, but one worth making nonetheless, is we have the return of Roz's Chanel compact here. This was last seen in the season 1 finale, and it's a nice bit of continuity to see her using it here again. We have another first on our title cards this week, with an underlined word added for emphasis. We've already established there's not a lot of rules when it comes to the title cards, but it's always interesting to make note when a new one is added to the existing ones. Patterson stops by Frasier's apartment to return his lucky tie, after it didn't do him any good in the election. I'm not sure whether to count this tie as one of Frasier's ties or not, but I think it's worth pointing out that this lucky tie isn't one we've actually ever seen Frasier wear. And it is actually pretty different from the ties Frasier routinely wears, which, with one exception, never has had a solid blue background. Although we don't actually see him here, and we won't see him again after his 2 appearances last season, we have an acknowledgement that Richard Poe's Chopper Dave is still around and doing his thing. Dave wasn't a great character. He only had one joke, and I wasn't particularly upset when I realized he wouldn't be making a 3rd appearance on the show. But with that said, this is a fun callback to him without him actually being on the show, and a completely different kind of joke than him just being deaf. Before we cut to our coda, we have an in memoriam for Robert Casey, who died at the age of just 50 years old. Crosby had worked off and on in sound since the 1960s, with a brief period where he worked primarily as a boom operator, which I guess is also in the sound department. He did some movies in the 70s and 80s, including The Lost Boys, One Crazy Summer, and Marathon Man, before moving primarily into television. He worked as a sound production mixer on the last 5 seasons of Cheers, and the entire first season of Frasier. This is our first episode with a dedication, and I think it's a very nice send-off to a man who put a lot of years into the Frasier and Cheers universes. Our coda finds Roz with both Luck Hari and young Mr. Wahlberg back in the cafe. There's no actual word spoken since it's a coda. Although I didn't find this to be a particularly funny coda, I did think it was a really nice contrast between how mean both Roz and Niles are to poor young Mr. Wahlberg. I'm not going to include Frasier's lucky tie here, as he doesn't actually wear it during the episode, but even without counting Frasier's lucky tie, he sports 3 ties in this episode, and 2 of them are new. The 3rd one is making its 2nd appearance here, after last showing up in Season 1, Episode 22. Niles also sports 3 ties this week, although 2 of them are repeats. His first tie is making its 5th appearance, after last showing up in episode 22 of season 1, and his second tie is making its 3rd appearance, after last showing up in episode 20. This brings Frasier slightly ahead of Niles in new ties at 35 to 34 unique ties apiece for the brothers. This is sort of an odd episode. We'd already done a very different election episode back in Cheers, which resulted in Woody getting elected to city council, and Frasier having some exceptionally funny dreams about it. With that said, despite retreading that same ground, we have a totally different and more serious approach to politics here. As I mentioned at the start of this video, given political divides, I would be very hesitant personally to assign political viewpoints to any of my characters, for the fear of upsetting one side of the audience or the other. With that said, Flett and Ramberg do it here, and they do it masterfully. It's very clear what side of the aisle everyone is coming down on, yet it doesn't do anything to take away from the characters or the episode. It all fits in very well with what we already know about the characters, and just makes for an all-around good time. The aliens and the misunderstanding that spawned from it were funny, if a little obvious as a joke, but given how much more serious one could have gone with a political scandal, this felt relatively harmless and a good overall choice to provide a gateway for Frasier to torpedo the campaign. Finally, the callbacks to Chopper Dave were great, and coupled with the poor boy selling chocolates, some of the best jokes of the episode. Andy Warhol said it best: art is whatever we can get away with. And in this case, it's lampooning politicians and aliens on this 7.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier.